Part 3. The third witness of our course in negative political theory also comes from Athens. We shall hear the testimony of Plato as the immortal source, who can tell us how the city was founded in a strange, new and subversive way, out of the spirit of philosophy. And because we ask him slightly different questions than usual, he will confirm that he founded not just one discipline, political theory, but another one into the bargain, namely negative political theory, in that he has been wondering for a long time while people who were later called Europeans, not to mention North Americans, have always considered him the initiator of the one art form alone, and have ignored the other one all the more. Perhaps it is merely capricious to question Baudelaire and Plato in immediate succession, because both can be seen as signifying typical moments in a broad continuum of the history of consciousness. When Baudelaire calls on an inner witness in his confession who carefully documents the relationship between the theatre of the city and its motive forces, he can do this basically because he is a successor to a Platonic discovery that was interrupted by Christianity. He uses what Plato first explicitly revealed, the soul's ability to conduct dialogues with itself and to be superior to itself in these dialogues. It is worth quoting the Locus Classicus itself here. In the fourth book of the Republic, Plato makes Socrates say, "Soberness, sophrosine, is a kind of beautiful order, and a continence of certain pleasures and appetites, as they say, using the phrase master of himself, I know not how, and there are other similar expressions that, as it were, point us to the same trail. Is that not so? Most certainly. Now the phrase master of himself is an absurdity, is it not? For he who is master of himself would also be subject of himself, and he who is subject to himself would also be master, for the same person is spoken of in all these expressions. Of course. But, said I, the intended meaning of this way of speaking appears to me to be that the soul of a man within him has a better part and a worse part, and the expression self-mastery means the control of the worse by the naturally better part. It is at any rate a term of praise. But when, because of bad breeding or some association, the better part, which is the smaller, is dominated by the multitude of the worse, I think that our speech censures this as a reproach, and calls the man in this plight unself-controlled and licentious. By simple deduction, we could work out that all Plato meant was a city reform from an aristocratic viewpoint. In this case, he would indeed be the prototypical conservative political theorist that school education depicts him as. In reality, he represented the beginning of an inner emigration of the better elements into a logical exile. The academy garden where masters and pupils gathered was not a theatre, not a marketplace, and not a stadium from where successful careers in civil society could be launched. Plato's plot of land was a terminal for ideas superior to the city. From the academy, people reached heights that important, self-assured citizens never attained. The best people did not reach such heights through fame and victory at all, but through clarifying ideas themselves by dint of shared discussion. It may be true that the academy could not have opened its doors anywhere else except in Athens, and its activity is certainly revealing in relation to the city and its key political and religious focal points. But at the decisive philosophical moment the doors were closed, and the intelligentsia, even if it spoke of the polis, was involved in a logical ascension in which very few of the dignitaries, let alone politicians, participated. The institution of philosophy has been able to live with this ambiguity for 2,500 years, and if I am emphasizing the negative or esoteric side of classical philosophy of the polis more than usual, it is only to confirm as extramuros what has evidently been intramuros since time immemorial. Outside the walls, philosophy means practice in urban synthesis. This means that cities are human network systems, and the art for the correct network system formation is the most important topic for the outer perspective of philosophy. From Plato's pupil Aristotle onwards to Hegel and his monstrous epigony, Lenin, philosophy has maintained its exoteric face, the face of political theory, and has commanded itself as the school of knowledge of art for political synthesis. In fact, philosophy, which means Platonism, was a spiritual exercise in superiority to urban reality from the very beginning, and was consequently never simple political theory, but a priori a theory of the other city, a theory of the city that does not exist anywhere, and that nobody journeys to without the aid of the semantic space travel that became later known under the name of ideas. Accordingly, Plato, whom Marsilio Ficino called Parter Philosophorum, was not so much the founder of positive political theory as the discoverer of a process of emigrating from the middle of the city into the other city, the Uranian polis, the Allopolis, the city that is quite different to this one. In Plato's greatest dialogue, Socrates speaks of the first citizen of Allopolis. Philosophy after the Republic is the philosophy of the establishment of allo-political theory in the existing polis itself. As a fundamentally subversive art form, it trains souls to rise from their own cities into super-urban exile. The Platonic Socrates must consequently perform his ideal urban critical play to the very end. It shows how people in Athens have to live as people who live differently if they want to be superior to the real inhabitants, particularly crude inhabitants like themselves. Plato's editing of the Socratic speeches of defence makes the most sense from this perspective. All philosophers become ipso facto post-Socratic when they accept Plato's interpretation that since Socrates' execution there has been a divorce between the city and the truth. Their judicial murder of the best and most righteous men was the rock on which the old city as a place for the good life foundered. Whether this necessarily had to happen or whether it was a reversible error is a question that Plato would not consider when he founded his academy. By setting up an exemplary school, he realized for the Athenians the prophecy that Socrates addressed in his Apology to those who voted for his death sentence. Now I wish to prophesy to you, O ye who have condemned me, for I am now at the time when men most do prophesy, the time just before death. And I say to you, ye men who have slain me, that punishment will come upon you straight away after my death, far more grievous in sooth than the punishment of death which you have meted out to me. For now you have done this to me because you hoped that you would be relieved from rendering an account of your lives. But I say that you will find the result far different. Those who will force you to give an account will be more numerous than heretofore, men whom I restrained, though you knew it not. The post-Socratic city had to live with the stigma that it would house philosophy and philosophers in the future. It would always be inhabited by individuals who do not flourish in the city, but stay in it like travelling doctors on a stage of the journey to large numbers of patients. At the same time, something started to blossom that we could call the utopia of the school. As we know, European cities are only as good as their academies of higher education. And these schools, with the city's consent, prepare their students for life in a much better city. This is why part of the magic of important European cities is a layer of eternal pupils who learn for the academy, and not by any means for life. If people wanted to make a fateful statement about the late 20th century in Europe, they would have to assert that the tension between city and school has ended, and that cities today have the schools they deserve. But as long as the spark of Plato has not completely died out, there will always be fresh educational approaches that train people for a better city that is nowhere to be found.